Esther King had lived in solitude on her ancestral farmland for many years. To the men who arrived in polished boots and sharp suits, she was merely an elderly black woman, lacking any obvious support. They saw her as isolated, a quiet figure, an easy mark. Their initial approach involved offers of money, which quickly escalated to undue pressure and ultimately outright aggression. Her tires were deliberately slashed, her livestock deliberately poisoned, and a stern ultimatum was issued. However, these men failed to recognize the profound history she carried within her. Years spent as a highly skilled military sniper, navigating wars conducted in hushed tones, achieving victories in the deepest of shadows. Therefore, when they attempted to seize what was rightfully hers under the cloak of night, they encountered a force they had never anticipated. Esther King did not falter. She fought with the same ferocity as if the war had never ceased. Before we proceed any further, please share your geographical location in the comments section below and ensure you subscribe, as tomorrow's narrative is one you absolutely won't want to miss. The dawn unfolded with a serene grace, a quality that only land nurtured by deep-seated memories could bestow. As the first golden hues began to paint the uppermost branches of the pecan trees, Esther King stood on the threshold of her porch. A mug of coffee, held with unwavering steadiness in her right hand, accompanied her as her gaze swept across the vast expanse of her inherited farmland. This land, which she had meticulously protected and understood down to the very last root and furrow, felt as though every inch of it were woven into the very fabric of her being. At 74 years of age, her posture remained erect, her movements deliberate, and her demeanor calm. This composure was not a result of time's leniency, but rather a testament to a lifetime of rigorous training that had conditioned her body to respond solely to discipline, impervious to fear, pain, or indeed any form of threat. The modest dwelling behind her, outwardly unassuming, was internally fortified in the most crucial ways. It was maintained in impeccable order, not for the infrequent arrival of guests, but because order itself was the language she comprehended most profoundly. Nothing in Esther's existence was left to mere chance. Her curtains were habitually drawn with an unfailing, consistent rhythm. The stove, once cool, was immediately cleaned, and the porch was swept with even strokes, irrespective of whether the preceding night's wind had been gentle or tempestuous. Her land was far more than simply a dwelling. It represented a protected perimeter, a sacred responsibility, and a living embodiment of every profound lesson etched into her very essence by the crucible of war. She had always intuitively understood that the soil beneath her feet harbored narratives far older than any structure. It was when she began to notice subtle disruptions along the soil line near her northernmost field, the faint, peculiar odor of chemicals after a rainfall, the slight discoloration in the water runoff, and the manner in which her late husband's geological notes had subtly alluded to potential subterranean resources, that she took decisive action. She did not succumb to panic, nor did she prematurely rejoice. Instead, she conducted her own thorough assessments, meticulously gathered samples, and, without confiding in a single soul, initiated the intricate and protracted legal process of securing her mineral rights. She enlisted the aid of a trusted attorney situated 3 counties away, a man indebted to her for more than a single favor, and one who understood the paramount importance of discretion when her name was mentioned in any public forum. This clandestine maneuver was executed with the same meticulous care and strategic calculation as any mission she had led during her tenure in uniform. Yet despite her rigorous precautions, word of her actions seemed to travel on currents she could not discern. For mere weeks after her legal filings commenced, unfamiliar trucks began to materialize near her property. Initially, they were observed parked along the gravel shoulder of the road, gradually moving closer with each subsequent appearance, always distinguished by their darkly tinted windows and pristine white exteriors. A stark contrast to the dust-caked local vehicles of those who genuinely worked this land. The men within these vehicles eschewed uniforms, but their bearing betrayed their origins. They exuded an air of relaxed alertness, far too keen for typical contractors, too professional for mere salesmen, and their eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reminiscent of individuals accustomed to entering spaces with an inherent intent to command. The first time one of them ventured up her driveway, he did so with an almost unnervingly polished smile, one that seemed to reflect the very sunlight. Clad in a button-down shirt, the sleeves casually rolled to his elbows, his attire deliberately projected an approachable demeanor. Nevertheless, the sharp edge in his voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone unaccustomed to being disregarded. He introduced himself as a representative of a real estate development consortium, expressing their keen interest in strategically acquiring rural properties. He explained that his team had become aware of the inherent value of her land and conveyed their hope to present her with an offer that would honor her legacy while simultaneously affording her the freedom to enjoy her remaining years without encumbrance. She did not extend an invitation for him to enter. She did not offer him refreshment. She listened intently, her gaze unwavering, her silence deliberately prolonged to the point of inducing a fleeting flicker of unease across his otherwise confident countenance. When he finally presented her with a pristine envelope, its flap adorned with elegant gold lettering, and politely suggested she take time to consider it, she accepted it without a word. It was only after he had departed that she proceeded to open it. That evening, as the sun descended behind the distant ridge and the cicadas filled the twilight with their insistent rhythmic chorus, she stood alone at the edge of her field. The opened envelope rested in her hand, its contents starkly presented in bold, unapologetic print. The figure offered was so substantial it might have prompted another woman to pause, perhaps even to indulge in dreams of opulence. However, Esther merely tilted her head slightly, her gaze returning to the land she had toiled for, bled for, buried her husband upon, and vigilantly protected for decades. Her devotion was not motivated by financial gain, but by an intrinsic sense of ownership that resonated on every meaningful level. She did not hesitate. She did not sigh. She simply returned to the house, opened the cast-iron stove door, and fed the offer to the flames. She watched, devoid of any visible emotion, as the paper blackened, curled inward, and ultimately transformed into ash. Her face was bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the heat, a subtle indication that in her world a definitive line had just been irrevocably crossed. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, and certainly no further warnings when individuals dared to inquire about the resources hidden beneath her soil. By morning, the ashes from the envelope had cooled into a delicate layer of soft gray at the base of the stove, the sole tangible evidence of a resolution firmly cemented in her mind. Esther meticulously rinsed her coffee mug, meticulously tightened the laces on her sturdy boots, and stepped onto the porch with a profound composure that required no overt declaration. The nascent light stretched across the fields in elongated golden bands, and for a fleeting moment everything appeared unchanged. The distant tree line remained steadfast, the fencing stood intact, and the gravel drive lay in quiet repose. Yet an undeniable shift permeated the atmosphere, a subtle intimation akin to the palpable feeling of an approaching storm, distant yet unmistakably present. She drove towards the courthouse as the town was just beginning to stir. The thoroughfares remained deserted, the shop fronts locked in hushed stillness. Her truck's engine hummed with a steady rhythm as she navigated the cracked asphalt, its bed empty, her passenger seat holding only the manila folder she had prepared weeks prior. She had signed each document with slow, deliberate strokes, her signature a steady affirmation across every form. It was more than mere ink. It represented a declaration of claim, an embodiment of intention, and a resolute act of defense. The courthouse lobby was permeated with the faint scent of floor polish and aging carpet, a fragrance that seemed perpetually confined to the baseboards, irrespective of the passage of time. Esther entered, offered a polite nod to the security guard, who was scarcely diverted from his crossword puzzle, and proceeded towards the records window. There, a young clerk, his hair slicked back with an excessive amount of product, his name tag identifying him as Derek, sat behind a smudged pane of protective glass. Without uttering a word, she slid the folder across the counter. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly in a double take, as if he had anticipated a different visitor. He then accepted the documents with an exaggerated sigh, as though handling paperwork from an individual like her at that particular hour somehow fell beyond the purview of his professional responsibilities. He scanned the uppermost page, tapped a few keys on his keyboard, and muttered an inaudible comment about the indexing of older filings proving to be rather cumbersome. Esther remained silent, observing his every move. His fingers danced across the keyboard with a speed that suggested haste rather than meticulous attention. As the final confirmation screen materialized, he paused for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering towards the hallway leading to the sheriff's office. Reaching beneath the counter, he retrieved his phone and, with an unfeigned lack of subtlety or shame, composed a message, his thumb hovering over the screen as if engaged in an endeavor of significant, albeit routine, importance. She registered the way his eyes deliberately avoided hers as he returned the receipt. There was no smile, no farewell. Outside, the sun had ascended higher, and the morning air had begun to warm. However, a distinct chill settled in the pit of her stomach, entirely unrelated to the ambient temperature. The clerk had dispatched a message. It was an unequivocal signal that an arrival was imminent, and indeed, they soon appeared. The SUV arrived 2 days later, its timing intentionally late enough to allow the morning fog to dissipate, but still early enough to preclude the observation of neighbors. It ascended her driveway with a measured slowness, its tires exceptionally clean, its suspension remarkably smooth, the kind of vehicle that belonged in the hushed environs of private parking garages rather than upon the rugged terrain of a gravel road. Esther was already positioned on the porch, her hands resting at her sides, awaiting their arrival. She had not outwardly armed herself, yet her posture alone conveyed a palpable sense of preparedness. The individual who emerged was attired in a deep navy suit, meticulously tailored, yet intentionally unbuttoned at the collar, paired with brown boots bearing just enough dust to suggest casual wear. His expression attempted to project an aura of concern, yet it failed to completely mask an underlying calculating nature. His blonde hair was combed back with unpracticed ease, and a pair of sunglasses, clipped to the second button of his shirt, served as a mere prop in a contrived tableau. "Miss King?" he inquired, advancing as if expecting her to meet him halfway. She remained resolutely stationary. "I am Cal Briggs," he stated, pausing for a beat as if his name were intended to carry inherent significance. "I represent a consortium that collaborates with owners of legacy properties, individuals such as yourself who have cultivated something of substantial value and may be contemplating a transition into a new phase of their lives." A subtle eyebrow arch was her only response. He pressed on. "I wish to engage with you directly, respectfully, before any formal procedures were initiated. You possess a truly magnificent property here, steeped in history, with sound, fundamental integrity, and beneath all this charm, well, let us just say that significant value awaits its discovery." He allowed this last phrase to linger in the air, much like a salesman testing the limits of his leverage before revealing his hand. "I am not selling," she declared, with unwavering finality. Cal offered a smile, but it was the kind of smile that failed to reach the corners of his eyes. "Of course not. No one is suggesting you hasten your decision. However, we would like to present a proposition simply to illustrate the possibilities. We have no intention of disrespecting your heritage." He paused, then added, "Lord knows you've maintained this place for a duration that would daunt most, especially considering all that is transpiring in this region." He let his gaze drift across the landscape, as though searching for any indication that she was no longer capable of managing it, as if the fallen leaves and cracked earth served as irrefutable proof that time had finally overcome her. He then retrieved a small envelope from the inner pocket of his coat and placed it gently on the porch railing beside her. "Review it at your leisure. It contains more zeros than troubles, I assure you." Esther did not look at the envelope. Instead, she met his gaze directly. "You have come here to inform me that I do not belong on my own land." His smile tightened infinitesimally. "Not at all. I have come to afford you an option. We prefer to collaborate with individuals who comprehend the evolving nature of the world. This is not a personal matter. It is simply business. You have demonstrated considerable acumen in preserving this property, Miss King, but we both understand. Land such as this, it will not remain undisturbed for much longer. It would be prudent to secure some benefit while it can still be considered unequivocally yours." There it was, not in the precise wording, but in the subtle cadence of his delivery, the inherent assumption that she lacked the discernment to understand what was best for herself. The veiled insinuation was that a woman of her stature, black, elderly, and residing alone on a parcel of land now coveted by white men, must surely have been oblivious to the unspoken directive that it was time to relinquish her claim. He did not utter a vulgarity. He did not raise his voice. However, Esther had lived long enough to recognize the underlying tone beneath the veneer of civility, the subtle assertion of control concealed within the guise of courtesy. She picked up the envelope, held it in her hand without opening it, and inquired, "Are you concluded?" Cal inclined his head, clearly taken aback. "Because if not," she continued, her voice steady yet laced with an unyielding resolve, "please proceed. I have ample time. However, if you are indeed finished, then I suggest you retrieve your boots and your offer and depart from my property before I am compelled to make you forget every single dollar contained within that envelope." The smile vanished from his face. He offered a curt nod, inhaled deeply, and returned to the SUV without uttering another word. As he drove away, his departure stirring a lingering swirl of dust that dissipated only after his vehicle had vanished beyond the tree line, Esther remained motionless on the porch. The envelope was still in her hand, and she listened as the wind swept across her fields, carrying a silent premonition that had already been acknowledged. The subsequent days unfolded with an unnatural quietude, as if the very land were holding its breath. The town, which had already begun to exhibit a subtle shift in its atmosphere, now felt entirely bereft of warmth. Individuals who had once exchanged greetings from their porches or paused for brief conversations outside the feed store now actively altered their routes to avoid her, their gazes invariably directed towards the ground, as if her very presence had become either radioactive or, worse still, irrevocably tainted. No one voiced their concerns directly, but the silence surrounding her felt less like an absence and more like a carefully orchestrated strategy, as if they were collectively endeavoring to safeguard something or someone by maintaining a deliberate distance. She first perceived this shift in the clerk at the general store, who meticulously bagged her purchases without meeting her gaze, or in the attendant at the gas station, who, in the past, would often engage in light-hearted banter about the weather, but who now stiffened noticeably as she pulled her vehicle alongside his. It was not precisely fear, nor was it pity. It was the identical expression she had observed on young soldiers stationed outside tents in remote desert landscapes, the kind of look that conveyed a pre-existing decision to maintain a safe distance to avoid becoming overly invested, as they did not wish to assume responsibility for whatever might transpire subsequently. Back at the farm, the indications escalated beyond subtlety. The initial incident involved a tire. She discovered it the morning after a rainfall, the ground still soft enough to retain the imprint of boot soles in the dirt, although the impressions had been partially obscured by a sweep of fallen leaves, a clumsy attempt to erase any evidence of their presence. The front driver's side tire of her truck had been deliberately slashed. The damage was not sufficiently deep to immediately generate noise or impede her progress, but it would have proven catastrophic if she had exceeded 40 miles per hour on the highway. It was sufficient to cause a vehicle to overturn if the circumstances aligned favorably. She did not utter a curse, nor did she contact anyone. She simply proceeded to replace the tire, meticulously noting its location in her notebook, and retrieved a more detailed roadmap from her desk drawer, one that clearly delineated off-grid travel routes should the conventional roads become compromised. A few nights later, her waterline ruptured without any prior warning. Initially, she attributed the failure to age, considering the copper pipe had been installed decades prior. However, upon excavating the damaged section for inspection, she discovered that the break was remarkably clean. Excessively clean, in fact. The metal had been severed with a tool far sharper than any associated with ordinary wear and tear. That night, she consumed boiled rainwater without comment. The following morning, she reconfigured her filtration systems and initiated the process of storing emergency reserves in securely sealed containers. It was not until she was surveying the goat pens near dusk and discovered her eldest nanny goat lying lifeless on her side, exhibiting signs of extreme bloating, that the subtle distinction between a warning and an outright declaration was irrevocably erased. The animal had been in good health, advanced in age, certainly, but robust in its eating habits and steady in its movements. There was no indication of any struggle, no discernible evidence of illness, only the characteristic foam around its mouth and the pronounced swelling in its joints, both definitive signs of deliberate poisoning. Esther remained in that spot for an extended period, her left hand braced against the fence rail, observing as the last of the flies settled upon the carcass, resembling winged shadows. She personally buried the goat at the periphery of the northern pasture, marking its resting place with a stone upon which she inscribed no inscription. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long, honey-colored streaks across the fields, she descended into the cellar located beneath the pantry. There, she opened the heavily reinforced cabinet that had remained undisturbed for over a decade. Within, her sniper rifle lay in perfect alignment, enfolded in oiled cloth. Each component had been meticulously cleaned and inspected annually on her birthday, a ritual born more of ingrained habit than immediate necessity. She unwrapped it deliberately, testing the telescopic sight, recalibrating the zero, and tracing her fingers along the stock as if deciphering Braille. It was an extension of her very being, as intimately familiar to her as her own respiration. She then retrieved her sidearm, loading it with methodical precision before securing it within the holster clipped to the inside of her waistband. She returned to the porch, not with trepidation, nor with burgeoning rage, but with a profound sense of arrival, as though a long dormant aspect of her nature had merely been awaiting implicit permission to reawaken. The ensuing days were dedicated to traversing her land with a deliberate silent purpose, not for the pleasure of observation or the task of harvesting, but for the meticulous process of cataloguing, diagramming, and preparing. She moved with purpose through the fields, equipped with a measuring tape, a compass, and a carpenter's chalk line, plotting distances against potential lines of sight, marking every natural point of concealment and every advantageous elevation. She painstakingly sketched a map by hand, identifying optimal firing angles, potential secondary positions, and critical choke points along the perimeter fencing where her property narrowed between the imposing oaks and the sheer bluff. Tripwires were strategically placed at shin height, interconnected with fine copper wire and artfully camouflaged with loose straw. She ingeniously devised perimeter alarms utilizing repurposed radios and pressure switches concealed within overturned feed buckets. The windows were meticulously measured, and blackout drapes were precisely trimmed and stitched with heavy cotton fabric to effectively absorb ambient light. The barn itself was reinforced from within, not with conventional planks or nails, but with an unwavering sense of anticipation and strategic foresight. Each night before retiring, she undertook a solitary patrol under the moonlight, meticulously counting her steps, vigilantly scanning for any displaced twigs, and measuring the prevailing silence by the conspicuous absence of cricket chirps. Then, on the sixth evening, just as the deepening shadows began to lengthen and the air acquired the faint, metallic scent of an impending rain shower, the SUV reappeared. This time, however, it was not alone. 2 additional trucks followed in its wake, their exteriors a darker hue, their headlights extinguished, their tires carving a slow, deliberate path across the gravel. Esther stood at the edge of her porch, her hands concealed within the deep pockets of her jacket, motionless, her gaze unwavering as Cal Briggs emerged from the lead vehicle. The individual accompanying him was noticeably taller and broader in the chest, his sleeves rolled high enough to reveal military tattoos, their clarity perhaps diminished by the passage of time or less than ideal circumstances. Cal no longer exuded the same polished confidence as before. This time, there was no pretense, no envelope, no introductory pleasantries, only a prolonged, silent progression to the lowest step of her porch, where he halted. He looked up at her with an expression that verged on a sneer and stated, his voice stripped of all former charm, "You have 2 weeks. That is all the time remaining for you to regain your senses." He surveyed her property, his gaze sweeping from the house to the barn and then towards the distant horizon. "After that," he continued, his voice low and remarkably even, "you will be incapable of preventing what is imminent, and you will deeply regret not accepting our offer when everything was still intact." She remained silent. She did not move, and as he finally turned to re-enter his truck, the sole audible sounds were the gentle rustling of the wind through the cornstalks and the low hum of his engine as it idled in the gathering twilight. The night following Cal's pronouncement passed without any overt incident, yet it ushered in a silence that felt unnaturally pristine, and almost absolute stillness, reminiscent of the hushed atmosphere in a corridor just moments before a door is violently thrown open. Esther slept lightly, her boots placed strategically beside her bed, her rifle within easy reach, each breath measured, every muscle poised just below the threshold of readiness. By morning, her decision had solidified, not as an impulsive reaction born of fear or pride, but as the only logical and unavoidable outcome when confronted with a threat that no longer bothered to conceal its true nature. She commenced her preparations precisely as she once had amidst the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, by meticulously traversing the terrain, not as a farmer tending her land, but as a soldier assessing a battlefield, reconfirming the details of a landscape already imprinted upon her by instinct. Every conceivable corner of her property became a variable within a carefully constructed equation. Every elevated point, every potential advantage was to be identified, marked, and leveraged to her benefit. She moved with deliberate intent through the tall grass, frequently kneeling to press her palm into the soft earth, testing its consistency, measuring its depth, and calculating how the ground would yield under the weight of approaching boots, and importantly, not her own. The initial tripwires were established at the periphery of the western field, artfully hidden amongst decaying foliage. They were positioned at such a low elevation that only those crawling would be able to detect them. Fine copper strands were strung between posts that, at first glance, appeared to be remnants of dilapidated fencing, but in reality served as carefully positioned anchors. Each wire was ingeniously linked to a series of concealed chimes and pressure sensors, which in turn communicated with an antiquated CB radio system she had personally refurbished. Upon activation of the wires, a signal would be transmitted, causing a subtle, silent vibration beneath her floorboards. There was no audible sound, no visible light, merely a palpable tremor through the very structure of the dwelling, announcing the intrusion into the outer perimeter. Within the confines of the barn, she meticulously cleared the central passage, relocated the animal provisions to the furthest wall, and secured the entrance with 2 robust oak beams she had preserved for such an exigency, though she never explicitly defined what that exigency might entail. From a hidden compartment beneath the grain storage, she retrieved a tarnished tin box, encrusted with dust and sealed with a combination lock. It was her late husband's and had remained undisturbed since the year of his passing. It took her a moment to recall the sequence, but her fingers found the correct digits before her conscious mind could grasp them, the muscle memory outstripping cognitive recall. Inside lay her husband's old journals, bound in canvas and filled with his characteristic, small, precise handwriting. They contained meticulous observations on water mains, gas pressure readings, and seismic data collected long before contemporary instruments corroborated his premonitions. Tucked within the pages of the final volume was a laminated map marked with slashes of red grease pencil, indicating various locations across the property. These were annotated in a cryptic code decipherable only by her and him, featuring symbols for observation posts, clear lines of sight, and fallback positions. Beneath the map, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, rested an external storage device. It bore no identifying marks or labels, merely a sleek black casing carrying the weight of something left behind, not out of idle curiosity, but as a measure of ultimate self-preservation. Esther set it aside, a quiet certainty settling within her that its moment would arrive, and the knowledge it contained would prove invaluable, serving either as a safeguard or a potent offensive tool. For the subsequent 3 days, she meticulously outfitted the house and the surrounding grounds with an array of covert cameras. These miniature devices, small enough to be nestled within tree hollows and along fence rails, were powered by solar units and fed their data into a laptop discreetly housed within a false drawer of her writing desk. The screens gradually illuminated, quadrant by quadrant, until the entire expanse of her property was rendered in a real-time visual display. Every tree line, every gate, every approach was observable from at least 2 distinct vantage points. She spent hours scrutinizing these feeds, adjusting camera angles, recalibrating their focus, and noting any remaining blind spots. It was during this painstaking process that she discovered the first scout camera. It had been strategically positioned high in a tree near the eastern incline, its camouflage remarkably effective, yet insufficient against the trained eye of someone who had spent a career discerning minute metallic glints from hundreds of yards away. With deliberate care, she ascended the ladder, retrieved the device, and proceeded to dismantle it on the tailgate of her pickup truck. It was far from amateur technology. It was compact, elegantly designed, and connected to a secured uplink. She promptly destroyed the internal microchip with the butt of her screwdriver, disposed of the casing in her burn barrel, and then systematically patrolled the perimeter until she located the second unit, concealed within a cleverly disguised knot on the bark of an ancient hickory tree adjacent to the creek bed. This particular device, however, she did not destroy. Instead, she rewired its transmitter, looped its recorded signal, and fed it footage captured 2 days prior. The images depicted a tranquil landscape, devoid of any discernible traps or unusual activity, a static tableau meticulously crafted to deceive any observer. If they were indeed watching, they would now be seeing absolutely nothing. That evening, she initiated contact with Isaac. He responded on the third ring, his voice bearing the gravelly resonance of either bourbon or fatigue, though with Isaac it was often difficult to ascertain which preceded the other. "Back in the game?" he inquired before she even uttered her name. "I never stepped away," she replied, her voice steady and low. "You calling means you need a scan," he stated. "4 square miles meticulously mapped. I require heat signatures, recent tracks, anything that crosses the tree line." "I'll have it for you within 24 hours. I'll pull from my NOAA backup. It should be clean." "Ensure it is. If they're monitoring my land, they're watching everything." A brief silence followed, not born of hesitation, but of mutual understanding. "You alone?" he asked. "I am sufficient," she declared. He offered no argument, merely exhaled through his nose and remarked, "You always were. Check your inbox tomorrow." She concluded the call without offering a farewell. By the following morning, she had re-established her primary sniper position within the old silo. Its steel framework, remarkably intact despite the passage of years, had been cleaned and fortified with sandbags, a blackout tarp, and a mattress ingeniously cut down from the guest room. From this elevated vantage point, she commanded unobstructed views of the access road, the northern woodland, and all 3 principal approach routes. She unlatched her rifle case, securely seated the magazine, made a minute adjustment to the scope, and then assumed a prone position, the stock pressed firmly against her shoulder, her eye aligned perfectly with the optical glass. Her breathing gradually slowed, and the wind whispered through the minute fissures in the metal walls. She loaded the final round and murmured to herself, her tone devoid of tremor, wavering, or fracture, not a prayer nor a curse, but the identical phrase she had whispered in every country, during every operation, in every critical moment where the trigger was her command and silence was the ultimate response. 0 wind. The sky had transformed into an inky expanse by the time the first subtle vibrations reached the foundation of her dwelling. Esther, lying prone within the loft of the silo, felt the faint tremor travel through the rifle stock before any visual confirmation was possible. A distinct rhythm in the gravel, soft yet deliberate, like footsteps attempting too assiduously to mimic those of deer. She remained utterly still. Her gaze did not waver. Her cheek remained pressed against the stock, her eyes fixed and steady behind the scope, the reticle meticulously tracking the moonlit slope leading to the fence line near the cattle gate. Then a change in illumination occurred, or rather, an absence of it. 3 sets of headlights extinguished in sequence as the vehicles advanced at a glacial pace. The movement was akin to predators encircling their prey when the urgency of the hunt overrides the need for caution. The vehicles fanned out with an unnerving silence, their doors opening with a calculated reserve that suggested a profound understanding of their adversaries and an assumption of control over the engagement. Tactical boots met the yielding earth. Gloves were adjusted on forearms. Suppressed weapons were brought to a ready stance. None of them looked upwards. They advanced in a synchronized, silent ballet, spreading into a formation as if rehearsed. She observed their progress, mentally counting each individual as they moved. 4 disembarked from the lead vehicle, 3 from the second, and 2 more trailed in the deeper shadows cast by the third. Their equipment was streamlined and dark, designed for swift surgical operations. Their objective was not merely to intimidate, it was to decisively conclude. With a slow, deliberate exhale through her nose, she initiated the engagement. The initial operative never registered the shot. The projectile traversed his neck just above the collarbone, the exit wound blooming silently across his left shoulder before his knees buckled and he folded sideways into the grass like a discarded sack of grain. The others remained oblivious for a moment, their focus on maintaining formation and executing their movements, failing to register the loss of a comrade. When the realization dawned, the second shot had already been discharged. It struck the subsequent target precisely as he stepped past a fence post equipped with an antiquated gravel mine. The projectile struck him through the ribs, staggering him directly into the mine's path. A second later, the wire snapped and a cascade of sharpened stones erupted from the buried canister, ingeniously constructed from a repurposed fertilizer drum. The ensuing detonation, while not deafening, was sharp enough to shatter the prevailing quietude, and almost immediately a voice bellowed the word she had anticipated. Sniper! The formation disintegrated, but their exposure was now absolute. Without hesitation, she transitioned to a new position, sliding backward from her nest with fluid grace, never deviating more than an inch from the ground. Within mere seconds, she had descended the ladder and was traversing the field via an irrigation trench which she had painstakingly deepened over the preceding week to facilitate covert movement between firing points. Mud adhered to her elbows as she advanced. Her rifle was slung securely across her back, her sidearm at her hip remained unholstered, untouched. She had no immediate need for it. Return fire commenced, wild, erratic, and fueled by panic. Muzzle flashes flickered intermittently from behind the storage shed and the tree lines, but the aim was consistently too high, too late, too desperate. She could discern the evidence of training, but not for this scenario, not for an adversary who possessed an intimate understanding of the terrain far surpassing their own command structure, not for an individual who had honed the art of silent elimination long before most of them had even begun to shave. She reached her secondary position, nestled within the shattered corner of an old hay barn, its supporting beams reinforced with sandbags, the crawl space beneath concealed with burlap and coated in a thick layer of dust. The field ahead was now a chaotic expanse of movement, shadows bobbing erratically between trees, interspersed with disembodied calls of position numbers that held no meaning in such uneven terrain. She cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and aligned the scope. Another operative fell, this one mid-stride, a perfectly placed shot to the thigh, sending him tumbling face first into the ditch. He attempted to crawl, his hands digging into the wet grass, but she had already adjusted the range for a decisive kill. She did not immediately fire. She observed him for a few crucial seconds, his fingers clawing at the dirt, his lips moving as if a silent prayer might avert his fate. She pulled the trigger. The profound silence that followed each shot was more unsettling than the discharge itself. It settled over the fields like a second skin, a heavy shroud draped across the earth, as if daring any living soul to speak, to breathe, to reclaim a sense of dominion over the night. But that dominion was hers. Down near the eastern fence, one of the remaining operatives inadvertently triggered a secondary trap, a tripwire ingeniously connected to a garden hoe and a propane flare. The sudden eruption of light illuminated the underbrush for just long enough to reveal two more targets who had sought refuge behind a stack of firewood. Though unable to engage both from her current angle, she fired regardless. One operative collapsed, while the other fled, his voice amplified by his radio, desperately requesting reinforcements. She relocated once more. Each movement was a calculated maneuver, each firing position meticulously prepared with small amenities earned through relentless repetition: water bottles, a rolled cloth for arm support, and a topographical map etched into wood with nail points. She rotated through 4 distinct positions before the enemy vehicles even considered a tactical withdrawal, before their tires finally spun futilely in the mud, retreating with the wounded and the shaken, drawing back into their metallic confines. The ultimate indignity they faced was being hunted by a woman whose hair bore streaks of gray and whose very being resonated with the echoes of past conflicts. By the time she reached the rear entrance of the house, the atmosphere within had already undergone a subtle transformation. It wasn't the acrid scent of smoke, cordite, or blood, though those would manifest later. It was a less tangible disruption in the air pressure, a whisper of forced entry, of boots treading upon floorboards that had never known the intrusion of strangers. Esther assumed a low crouch behind the coat rack in the utility hallway, her sidearm drawn, her body poised on the balls of her feet, her respiration shallow and controlled. The breach had been executed with a degree of stealth, an attempt to infiltrate like shadows into a dwelling designed for spectral inhabitants. However, her acute hearing detected every creak of a floorboard, every whispered communication between individuals trained for urban assaults, but utterly unprepared for the defense mounted by a woman who had spent her formative years navigating death through structures far more unforgiving than this one. The first operative advanced through the kitchen, his rifle held low, his flashlight beam sweeping in wide arcs across the cabinetry and tiled surfaces. Esther allowed him to pass the pantry before activating a smoke bomb she had concealed within the oven's unused lower compartment. The room was instantaneously enveloped in a thick white haze, obscuring every outline. She moved through it with the fluidity of water, silent and precise, her shoulder grazing the edge of the breakfast bar as she ducked behind it, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The second operative entered through the side window, his feet landing with a soft thud on the kitchen mat, which he had rigged with roofing nails protruding from its underside. His cry of pain was muffled, a testament more to surprise than to genuine agony. She utilized the sound to mask her own movement, sliding behind the first operative and striking the crook of his elbow with the butt of her pistol. The weapon clattered from his grasp. He turned, momentarily disoriented, only to receive a sharp blow to the bridge of his nose. Blood splattered the refrigerator door behind him as he stumbled backward towards the sink. She wasted no time. Her left hand swiftly moved beneath his jaw, her knife held tightly between her fingers. She drove the blade into the soft tissue just below his chin and twisted sharply to the left. He collapsed without a sound. A flash of light to her right alerted her to the presence of the third operative just moments before he opened fire. The bullet grazed her shoulder, the searing heat tearing through the outer fabric of her jacket and biting into her skin with a sting sharp enough to jolt but not incapacitate her. She dove behind the dining table, her hand already reaching for a second smoke canister, which she tossed with an overhand motion toward the hallway, just as a boot struck the edge of the table, tipping it sideways and sending plates crashing to the floor. The flare hissed as it ignited, showering sparks into the stairwell. The hallway erupted in pulsating red light, like a heartbeat amplified to an unbearable volume. She saw the shadow of the shooter first, tall and swift, moving with an unsettling confidence. As he stepped forward, she fired from her prone position, the shot low and tight, striking him in the left knee. He went down screaming, the firearm spinning from his grasp and bouncing once before skidding into the baseboard. She rose quickly, her shoulder throbbing, and retrieved the blade from her belt. Blood dripped onto the floor as she closed the distance between them, her breathing labored but silent. Then, without ceremony or hesitation, she drove the knife into the base of his neck. He twitched once, then lay still. A subtle creak behind her, small and deliberate, indicated someone moving with extreme caution. She did not turn. Instead, she spun the desk lamp nearest to her, directing its cone of light across the far end of the hallway, then dropped low, crawling beneath the table as the intruder entered from the rear stairwell. She observed his legs move past her hiding spot, steady and careful, his breathing controlled. He was intelligent, assessing angles, disregarding distractions, but not sufficiently so. Esther reached up and pulled the cord of the swing lamp positioned just above the bookshelf. The movement drew his gaze for a fleeting half-second, just enough time. She lunged forward and stabbed upward, the blade slipping through the bottom of the lampshade and into his chest with a force that caused the shade itself to rattle. The man gasped, staggered backward, and collapsed into a chair, gurgling as his lungs filled with blood. Only then did she pause, leaning against the wall, panting, her hand pressed to the bleeding groove along her shoulder. It was not a deep wound, but it would require attention. Not yet. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. The remaining adversaries had either retreated, regrouped, or fallen victim to her traps and precise marksmanship. Inside, the only sound was the labored exhalation of a single remaining operative, barely alive. He lay face down near the kitchen entrance, his rifle out of reach, his hand clutched to his side where she had struck him with the blunt edge of her blade, rendering him unconscious mere moments prior. She retrieved a zip tie from her coat pocket, roughly rolled him onto his stomach, and bound his wrists with practiced efficiency. Then, with a grunt and a final breath to steady herself, she dragged his inert body down the hallway, through the back door, and across the yard towards the barn. A trail of blood marked her passage, dark and glistening in the cold moonlight. The war had infiltrated her home. Now she would carry the conflict to theirs. By the time she secured the barn doors behind her and emerged back into the field, the landscape had already begun to subtly transform. It was not the wind or the rustling trees that had changed, but the air itself, now thicker, heavier, pulsating with a tension, born not of fear, but of an unshakable certainty that whatever was coming next was engineered for utter devastation. The initial wave had been a probe, an underestimation of her capabilities. The subsequent assault would be something entirely different. She had traversed only halfway to the front pasture when the silhouettes became apparent. Larger this time, advancing in a more compact formation, heads bowed and shoulders squared, as if they had executed such maneuvers repeatedly in environments where compassion was entirely absent from their operational parameters. The trucks did not halt at the road. They surged forward with engines silenced and lights extinguished, their tires gliding noiselessly over the gravel and mud as if they had trained for darkness and silence with the same singular intensity she had dedicated to mastering silence and death. She counted 9 operatives on foot, moving with remarkable speed. Their bodies were bent beneath the considerable weight of their heavier equipment. Breech kits, shields, canisters secured to their packs, and hammers in hand. Their coordinated movements suggested they were more than mere mercenaries. They possessed a discipline that hinted at something far more organized and resolute. From her concealed vantage point behind the irrigation tank, she observed as 2 of them approached the rear entrance, their forms low beneath the living room window. One carried a gas canister, the other a sledgehammer, and simultaneously, both looked up, nodding once before preparing to strike. She did not hesitate. With a swift flick of her wrist, she triggered the tripwire that extended from the doghouse post to the base of the porch steps. The wire, invisible in the darkness, instantly dislodged the latch on a flare rigged above the gutter. In a sudden, piercing burst of shrieking light, the front yard erupted in a blinding white inferno. They recoiled instinctively, shouting for cover, but the ensuing confusion had already begun to propagate. 2 more operatives, who had advanced widely toward the south pasture, ran directly into the claymore-equivalent device she had buried beneath a false trough. The detonation, while not deafening, was precise, sending shards of jagged rebar and thick, wet earth into the side of the tractor, claiming one of the attackers in its explosive embrace. She moved with swift urgency, darting from the tank to the garden trench, her shoulder flaring with pain with every stride. The leg wound sustained during the earlier engagement had tightened, stiffening with cold and dried blood, but it did not impede her progress. She reached the communications jammer, situated beside the compost bin, a reconfigured field radio linked to a solar power cell, and a frequency disruptor she had acquired secondhand from a ham radio operator whose allegiances were somewhat ambiguous. She powered it on and slid the dial to the dead zone between law enforcement and commercial radio bands, observing the green light flash once, then stabilize. Their radios would now be rendered useless, and they wouldn't even comprehend the reason why. Gunfire erupted near the barn, wild, scattered, and desperate. She dropped flat against the row of overturned soil, crawling until she reached the fence post adjacent to the willow tree and sighted in through the scope mounted on her backup rifle. One of the attackers had taken shelter behind her wheelbarrow, firing blindly into the darkness as if expecting an answer. She steadied her breathing, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. He dropped forward into the dirt, his body limp before it even made contact. At the house, the final breach occurred. The back door splintered under the impact of the hammer, the metal frame groaning with a sound that echoed across the yard like a church bell shattered by fire. Esther knew they would enter through the kitchen first, that they would establish positions, clear the area, and assume their speed would grant them the decisive advantage. What they failed to realize was that she had displaced the refrigerator from its customary location, replacing it with a steel rod mounted on a frame, bent at an angle positioned just above eye level. She reached the porch seconds after their entry and slipped through the shattered siding on the north wall. Navigating the smoke-filled hallways, she exploited their disorientation to her advantage. Two operatives were already blinded by the flash flares, their eyes rubbing, their weapons swinging low. A third advanced with deliberate intent, pushing through the smoke, barking orders that bore no resemblance to standard military cadence. She ducked beneath a sweeping flashlight beam, pressed herself against the pantry wall, and waited for the telltale thud of his boot to pass the threshold. Then she struck. The rod connected with the side of his head just above the ear, and the man dropped instantly, collapsing with a guttural sound onto the floorboards. She reached down to turn him over, and her hand froze. Cal. Even with his face bloodied and jaw hanging slack, he was undeniably him. The same self-satisfied curve to his jawline, the same polished arrogance now slumped in a disheveled heap beneath the stark illumination of her kitchen light. With swift efficiency, she secured his wrists, then hauled him by his shoulders down the hallway, leaving him behind the overturned dining table before going back to secure the house. As dawn finally broke, it did so with an ordinary lack of fanfare. The field exhaled wisps of smoke, while patches of churned earth gleamed softly in the nascent light. Her porch was a disarray of discarded items, battered boots, depleted ammunition casings, a gas mask dangling from the railing like a discarded husk. 3 of them had survived. 2 of Cal's subordinates lay prone in the grass near the western perimeter, stripped of their weaponry and gear, their arms bound tightly behind them with electrical cable. Cal himself remained indoors, his groans a low murmur as he shifted sluggishly, as though expecting to awaken in a more comfortable, gentler, and safer place. Esther stood at the crest of the porch steps, her body slick with perspiration and grime, the blood staining her shirt a grim melange of her own and others. Her breathing remained measured. Her gaze swept the tree line, the road, the distant horizon. When no further movement came, when no more vehicles appeared, no second wave following the first, she exhaled slowly, allowing her shoulders to slump forward slightly. She then whispered the same words her husband had once uttered after they had endured a grueling 36-hour siege in a remote compound at the farthest reaches of civilization. That's all of them for now. Stepping down onto the lawn, her boots made no sound on the rain-slicked ground, now darkened with blood. She proceeded to retrieve what they had presumably believed they could abandon. The barn, bathed in the clear light of day, appeared entirely unremarkable to an unfamiliar observer, betraying no hint of its secondary function. Its wide crimson doors, weathered to a soft sheen by years of sun and use, hung slightly askew on their hinges, and the rust-encrusted latches still bore the imprints of bygone eras. Inside, however, the space had undergone a profound metamorphosis, not into something grotesque or terrifying. Esther had never found theatrics necessary to convey her intent. Instead, it had become a sanctuary of deliberate, palpable silence where every creak of timber or drip of water served a purpose beyond mere auditory input. The three men were bound to robust chairs, which she had anchored to the concrete floor days prior. Each was positioned at a slight remove from the others, just far enough apart to preclude whispered communication or the observation of each other's facial expressions, yet close enough to hear every sound. Their wrists were secured with zip ties, their ankles fastened with paracord pulled taut against floor brackets. Duct tape had sealed their mouths during their transit. It was now removed with a slow, deliberate motion, not to permit speech, but to gauge their reaction to its absence. Esther remained silent for the initial hour. She moved among them with quiet precision, adjusting portable tripod-mounted lights, dabbing at a trickle of blood on her temple with a cloth soaked in cold rainwater, and resetting the battery on the small field recorder she had positioned on a shelf above Cal's head. She allowed the barn to settle into its own rhythm, punctuated by the distant, irregular ticking of a roof leak, the wind sifting through the high slats along the back wall, and the steady, unhurried drip of water from a metal pail suspended just above the concrete near the far door. Every sound was intentional, and nothing was rushed. She poured water from a tin kettle into 3 canteens, placing them on the ground just beyond their reach, then illuminated the space with a single hanging bulb that swayed lazily overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across the barn floor. When she finally procured a folding chair and sat facing them, her expression was inscrutable, neither hard nor cruel, merely quiet and utterly in command. "You came here to erase me," she stated, her voice low and steady. "You failed." No one responded. One of the subordinates, lean and younger, breathing through gritted teeth, shifted infinitesimally in his chair. The other remained perfectly still, eyes closed, either conserving energy or feigning indifference. Cal met her gaze without faltering. Dried blood streaked his jaw where she had struck him, and his right eye was beginning to swell shut, yet his demeanor remained composed, as if his training still dictated that posture equated to strength even in this dire situation. Even now Esther rose, walked deliberately to the back wall, and retrieved a small handheld speaker connected to her recorder. She pressed play, and the space filled with the cacophony of gunfire, the squelch of boots in mud, and the distant fractured shouts of command from the preceding night. This was more than mere sound. It was irrefutable evidence, a chronological account, a record of events that had transpired when they believed they still held dominion. As the recording concluded, she turned to the younger man. "You want to tell me who's in charge now?" she inquired. He remained silent. She gave a single nod and moved to the light, angling the bulb directly into his face, and stood there, motionless, as the heat began to bear down on his resolve. 10 minutes elapsed. 20. Sweat beaded at his temples, then trickled down his neck. He shifted again, blinked rapidly, and swallowed dry air. Esther did not touch him. She did not raise her voice. She simply nudged the water bottle an inch closer, then stopped, allowing the silence to exert its full effect. "I'm not dying for this," he finally muttered, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Who are you dying for, then?" she asked, crouching slightly, her tone calm and even. He hesitated. "We don't know names, just designations. We're informed of the timing, the location, how the funds arrive from out of state, transfers, cash drops, sometimes fictitious construction bids." A pause, then she inquired, "And Cal?" without looking at him. "Middleman," the man whispered. "He designates the land we're to clear." She walked over to Cal, crouched before him, meeting what remained of his gaze. Do you wish to continue playing the professional, or shall I let him keep talking?" Cal offered a smile, but it was now a strained, hollow grimace. "You're not going to kill me, Miss King." "No," she replied, "but I don't need to." She retrieved a folder from the shelf, one of her husband's. She laid it open on the table beside Cal's chair, leafing through pages marked with land registry codes, transfer documents, and surveys, all pertaining to the property surrounding hers. "You've been here before," she stated. "Years ago. Quiet acquisitions, coercive liens, families who departed in the dead of night. You were part of that influx, weren't you?" Cal offered no verbal reply, but the flicker in his expression was sufficient. She slid a photograph across the table, a grainy black and white image captured by a drone years earlier depicting Cal standing with Cobb outside a state land auction office. "Do you believe no one was observing?" she questioned. "Did you imagine my husband hadn't foreseen what was unfolding?" Cal's lips parted slightly. He inhaled, but remained silent. She leaned in, her voice softening, almost tenderly. "Have you ever disclosed to your daughter how you generate your income, Cal? Because I will. I'll tell her, and I'll inform the courts, and I'll dispatch this audio recording to every publication west of the Mississippi, if necessary." His jaw tightened. "Sheriff Cobb," he finally divulged, his voice rough as gravel. "He receives the names. He handles the filings. He knows whom to pressure." "The rest of us, the cleanup crew, and the registrar?" she inquired. Cal nodded once. "Her role was to impede your paperwork. You were not intended to file within the allotted time frame. Once the window closed, we would proceed, claim adverse possession, fabricate a chemical spill, condemn the land, the usual modus operandi." Esther pressed the stop button on the recorder, then stood. "You placed me on a list," she stated, her voice now low, imbued with a sentiment far older than anger. "You had no inkling of the caliber of name you were striking out." She walked to the door, opened it to the stark morning light, and allowed the silence to hang in the air behind her like a deferred judgment. Within the barn, the men remained bound, but the narrative had already begun to unravel. She did not return to the house immediately. Instead, she walked the perimeter of her property, one slow step after another, her boots sinking into the still damp earth, the cool morning breeze rustling through the trees with a hush that only followed a night of conflict. The barn doors remained shut behind her, their interior still shrouded in the weight of confession. And though the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the light offered no sense of purity. A palpable awareness permeated the atmosphere, a shift not merely in what had transpired, but in what had been revealed. By the time she stepped through her front door, the adrenaline had subsided, leaving a dull ache in her joints. Her hands, still bearing streaks of dried blood, moved with an almost unconscious familiarity as she lit the stove, boiled water, and poured herself a cup of coffee she never actually drank. The cup sat cooling by the window as she reached into the drawer beneath the sink and retrieved the old green ledger she hadn't accessed in years, the one her husband used to conceal beneath the third floorboard in their bedroom, marked only by a frayed ribbon and a faint cross on its spine. The journal was not what it appeared. It never had been. The initial pages contained lists of fencing materials, feed calculations, and crop rotation schedules. However, after the second section, the entries changed. The handwriting became tighter, more deliberate, and the dates grew sporadic. Esther recognized the pattern immediately. It was operational shorthand, a method they had employed in the field when notes required disguise as logistics or inventory. Her husband, who had departed military service with invisible wounds and a mind still attuned to mission cadence, had embedded a cipher within its pages, a contingency should anyone ever seek to comprehend what he had been unable to articulate. She angled the journal sideways, beneath the morning light, and traced the faint red pencil lines, deciphering coordinates hidden within supply totals and names concealed within expense columns. The patterns were old but familiar, and as she decoded them, the truth began to coalesce with excruciating clarity. He had known about the gas deposits years ago, not from a neighbor or a company report, but from a discreet contract signed by an out-of-state agency that had identified the mineral content beneath their land as highly valuable. He had refrained from telling her because he had been working to obstruct the process from within, utilizing outdated surveys and technical obfuscation to delay exploration permits. He had wished to spare her worry. He believed he could buy them time, but someone had discovered his efforts. The entries near the end became increasingly ominous. There were notations of meetings with a state official, a man who had promised discretion and had accepted copies of forged maps, assuring her husband they would be buried beneath other filings until the political climate shifted. Esther scrutinized the dates. One entry stood out, circled twice in black ink and followed by a single shaky line of script. Meeting confirmed. Cobb's name arose. Prudence is paramount. That was the final entry. Her husband had perished in a single vehicle accident on the highway returning from that very meeting. The truck was discovered mangled in a ravine. The official report cited brake failure. No autopsy was conducted. Sheriff Cobb was the first responder. He had personally delivered the folded flag and condolences. Esther closed the journal, her fingers resting on the worn edge of the last page, her breath shallow but steady. The sounds from outside, bird song, wind, the distant groan of tree limbs, faded until only the pulse in her ears remained, and the profound weight of understanding settled in her chest. This had not been solely about a land grab. It had not been merely about the gas, the title, or the money. It had been a cover-up. The final component of a scheme initiated years ago, left incomplete because her husband had obstructed them for too long. She had become a target not only for her mineral rights, but because she was the wife of a man who had made it his mission to protect those rights and who had paid for his efforts with his life. She rose slowly and walked into the living room, opening the drawer where she kept the last photograph of him, the one in uniform, standing beside her on the day they returned home together for the final time. His smile in that photograph was not forced or cautious. It was complete. "So that's why they truly came," she whispered. Her voice did not tremble. It carried a quiet finality, sounding more like a solemn pronouncement than an expression of grief. Outside, the barn remained secured. The men within, unaware that the narrative had shifted once more, not merely in their failure, but in the underlying reasons for it. Esther sat at her husband's old desk and opened the field radio, dialing a frequency they used to joke was exclusively for emergencies. Static crackled for a moment before clearing. She keyed the microphone and leaned in. "Isaac," she said, her voice low but deliberate, "I need you to retrieve the accident report from March 23rd, 8 years ago. Franklin County, 1 fatality. I want every detail, witness statements, signatures, and the name of the responding officer." The pause on the other end was brief. "Understood," Isaac replied. "That will require some creative maneuvering." "I don't care what it takes," she retorted. "And I want the drill site registry logs for anything filed near County Line 17 within the last 10 years. Look for aliases, out-of-state limited liability companies, anything that intersects with Cobb's name." He hesitated. "You're not slowing down, are you?" Esther did not flinch. "No," she replied. "I'm just getting started." She set the microphone down and picked up the photograph again. There would be no more half measures. Not this time. The house was still, but there was no peace within it. Esther moved with a calm, sharpened by clarity. Her body was weary but unyielding, her wounds bandaged tightly beneath her sleeves. The storm outside had passed, but the true work, the kind built not on gunpowder, but on paper and evidence, was only just beginning. The confessions still echoed in her ears, but she did not replay them. She had no need to. Every word was now etched into her memory, and memory, unlike audio tape, did not degrade or skip. In the corner of the room, the old field laptop hummed softly, its fan whirring just loud enough to remind her that this phase of the conflict would demand a different kind of precision. She inserted the SD card, the red one marked with an X, in her late husband's handwriting. A relic from habit, from a time before external drives had superseded most of their field equipment. The files loaded without incident. She opened them one by one, checking audio levels and scanning for timestamp discrepancies. Each file was meticulously labeled. Confession 1, Cal Briggs. Confession 2, Operator Number 3. Confession 3, Target Sequence Breakdown. A master folder contained geotags, land records, corrupted transfer receipts, and a side-by-side comparison of the delayed filings cross-referenced with Cobb's name. Evidence, not conjecture. She encrypted backups onto 3 separate drives, 2 physical and 1 virtual, placing one into a hollowed-out floorboard beneath the hallway rug, another into a waterproof pouch she buried beneath the azaleas in the west garden. The virtual version was uploaded to a secure cloud hub managed by one of Isaac's former surveillance contacts in Nevada, an individual who owed them numerous favors and refrained from asking questions unless it was a matter of keeping someone alive. By noon, 3 identical packages sat on the table, plain cardboard, sealed with craft tape, each addressed by hand. One was destined for a small investigative newsroom in Mobile with a reputation for pursuing corruption cases that larger outlets avoided. Another was addressed to a state government watchdog organization that had initiated lawsuits against Cobb's office twice in the preceding 5 years. The third, the most substantial, was bound for a retired federal prosecutor now hosting a legal podcast that had publicly questioned the legitimacy of land seizures in the state's southern counties just last month. Each box contained a thumb drive, a transcript, and a note penned in Esther's measured hand. You do not know me, but you recognize the pattern. Here is what it looks like when someone survives it. She delivered the parcels herself, utilizing the old truck with the stolen license plates that Isaac had sent her the previous spring as a jest that had proven unexpectedly useful. She mailed each package from a different post office in 3 separate towns, never lingering long enough at any stop to be recognized. At each location, she left a small fragment of her silence behind and departed with nothing but empty air. That night, with the barn secured and her house once again dark but fully monitored, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to a name she had not written in years: Mariah Knox. She had encountered her once, years prior, at a veterans' rights rally where the young lawyer had spoken about environmental displacement and legal protections for underserved landowners. Mariah had spoken not with anger, but with clarity, and clarity, Esther had learned, was a rarer commodity than rage among those who battled systems such as these. Mariah had since established a notable reputation, challenging corrupt pipeline contracts and securing 3 injunctions against state-backed drilling corporations implicated in interstate fraud. Esther had not required her assistance before. She did now. She placed the call shortly after 10 o'clock. The phone rang 5 times before a calm, no-nonsense voice answered. Mariah Knox, this is Esther King. You don't know me, but you've been tracking my land. A pause, then the sound of a laptop keyboard tapping. You filed the mineral claim out of Franklin. 72 acres filed late, but it was approved. That's correct. What occurred? They attacked me at night, in force. Did you defend it? Yes, Esther replied, and I recorded everything. Mariah's tone shifted, not with disbelief, but with keen interest. Do you possess documentation? 3 audio files, 2 names, 1 signed order blocking the mineral registration, forged by a county registrar. I have Cobb implicated in LLC transfers and a confession that includes the phrase, she was always on the list. There was a sharp exhalation on the other end, then silence. I have a press contact at the Ledger, Mariah said finally, and I am 2 weeks away from filing an ethics complaint against the Energy Land Board. If I introduce this into court, it will fundamentally alter the basis of my case. Are you secure? Safer than they are. Good. Then here is what we will do. They conversed for over an hour, discussing details with the precision of 2 officers planning a coordinated operation. Mariah would orchestrate the press release, initially as an anonymous source, but authenticated through geotagging and confirmed metadata. She would file for an emergency injunction on Esther's behalf, then expand the lawsuit to encompass whistleblower protection once the information became public. A civil racketeering charge would follow, naming Cal Cobb and the registrar, supported by the filed evidence, the audio confessions, and Esther's testimony. By the time Esther concluded the call, the legal fuse had already been ignited. She leaned back in her chair, the ache in her shoulder settling beneath the surface once more, and gazed at the old wooden beams overhead. This house, battered and repaired, and braced against storms, both natural and man-made, had held its ground. It would continue to do so. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, not howling, but whispering, as if the land itself had drawn a breath. In the barn, the men remained bound, and the recorder clicked softly on its timer, logging each hour as further testament to their survival. And somewhere beyond the trees, far from the blood-soaked ground they had attempted to seize, Sheriff Cobb was already beginning to sense the tremors of something he could not control. The barn stood quiescent in the distance, its weathered siding veiled in morning mist, the rising sun casting long shafts of amber light across the yard. From the exterior, no sign of activity was visible, but within its walls, beneath the steady clicking of the timer and the faint rustle of shifting weight, the unraveling had already commenced. Not with shouting or violence, but with silence and consequence. A reckoning that moved like groundwater, slow, inexorable, and deeply rooted. The digital evidence had vanished, disseminated through encrypted networks, and channeled with surgical precision and complete anonymity to various news organizations, legal repositories, and governmental oversight bodies. Cal's voice, strained from his admissions, resonated through audio recordings that correlated with financial statements and property deeds, linking individuals and identities that had previously remained concealed in plain view. Every clue they had pursued was one that Mariah Knox was capable of tracking. In Atlanta, Mariah operated with unwavering efficiency. Her office remained illuminated throughout the night, her communication devices constantly buzzing with alerts from anonymous informants, investigative journalists, and professional investigators attempting to comprehend the magnitude of the clandestine operation. Aided by Esther and utilizing Isaac's recovered radio transmissions, she meticulously mapped a network of corruption that extended far beyond the jurisdiction of Cobb's police force or Cal's brute strength. This corruption permeated corporate takeovers, political campaign funding, and improper dispersal of public funds, each stratum concealed beneath the next, akin to decay hidden beneath ornamental flooring. She followed financial flows that traversed continents, were routed through offshore trusts, passed through numerous shell corporations with obscure alphanumeric identifiers, and re-emerged as illicit payments disguised as property value adjustments. She documented every detail before uttering a single word, awaiting the complete revelation of the intricate picture. The culmination arrived not with a grand announcement, but with a series of stealthy federal enforcement actions conducted just before dawn, executed with deliberate quietness, designed to intercept systems still active and premises still accessible. Armored vehicles navigated unpaved access roads and shadowed laneways, their movements orchestrated from a centralized command post situated 2 towns away. Law enforcement officers carried meticulously prepared arrest warrants, their operations marked by sharp precision and flawless timing. No pre-event notifications were disseminated to local media, and no early warnings were leaked. This deliberate silence was a strategic element of the plan. 7 distinct locations were simultaneously targeted within a span of less than 30 minutes. 2 expansive rural estates, an aircraft hangar situated on a private airfield, a satellite office in the city center masquerading as a real estate firm, a riverside lodge utilized for secluded retreats, and 2 unassuming residences belonging to members of the State Energy Commission's board. Each site contained stacks of unfiled documentation, encrypted storage devices, and decades' worth of liabilities poised for exposure. Esther remained detached from any media coverage. She sat at her late husband's desk, her gaze fixed on the wood grain, her hand resting on the very radio she had used to contact Isaac mere days prior. She harbored no interest in sensational headlines or public pronouncements. She had no desire to engage in discussions about the legality or proportionality of her actions. The land remained her property. Her identity remained her own. This was sufficient for her. Concurrently, Cobb's attempt to evade capture was characterized by a blend of overconfidence and desperation. He had traversed 3 states in a leased sport utility vehicle, his passport a fraudulent document indicating a Florida birth date, and his driver's license bore a Mississippi registration number that had expired over a decade earlier. He checked into a modest roadside motel under the alias Leland Gibbons, paying with cash. He purchased new attire from a local sporting goods store, nervously shaved his face in the motel mirror, and attempted to disappear into the anonymity of the tranquil locales he had once patrolled with unchecked authority. However, the comprehensive surveillance network had already been activated. He was intercepted by a state patrol officer shortly after crossing the levee. The vehicle had been flagged prior to his entry into the county. Within the sport utility vehicle, authorities discovered disposable mobile phones, a substantial quantity of foreign currency, and a map marked with 3 border crossings circled in red ink. He offered no resistance to the arrest. He merely gazed into the surrounding trees as if hoping for a final opportunity to escape, but no further avenues for evasion remained. Back on Esther's property, the individuals she had apprehended and bound in the barn were still situated precisely where she had left them, quiescent, motionless, and entirely incapable of escape. She had not communicated with them since their final recorded admission. There were no threats issued, no questions posed, and no expressions of triumph, only sustenance placed within their reach, replenished water, and a low humming heater in the corner, sufficient to prevent freezing but inadequate to provide any measure of comfort. When the initial contingent of federal agents arrived on her land, she met them at the entrance without any visible weaponry, carrying only a folder containing the access credentials for the encrypted backups and the digital key to her own meticulously kept records. She gestured towards the barn and stated with a composure devoid of pride or hesitation, "There are 3 individuals inside. They were armed upon arrival and are all alive now." The agents acknowledged her statement with a nod, expressed their gratitude, and proceeded without further exchange. The agents processed the detainees without incident, noting the medical attention they had already received and the clear indications of restraint rather than abuse. The men were manacled and escorted away, no longer operatives or enforcers, but rather witnesses and crucial evidence in a case they had never envisioned extending beyond their immediate locale. Cal, despite his prior boasts and threats, provided a comprehensive deposition within 48 hours. Confronted with an overwhelming body of evidence, federal charges, and a multitude of Confederates eager to exchange their knowledge for reduced sentences, he assumed the role of a cooperating informant. His testimony was instrumental in the filing of 3 federal indictments and contributed to the expedited issuance of subpoenas targeting 2 sitting state energy commissioners. Back at the courthouse, Esther's legal documentation, which had previously been subject to inexplicable delays, misplacements, or intentional obstructiveness, now moved through the system seamlessly. The judgmental glances from court clerks ceased, and no further instances of misfiled signatures or forgotten official stamps occurred. Her legal title was reinstated, her mineral rights were unequivocally secured, and her ownership was reaffirmed at all administrative levels. When questioned about her willingness to participate in court proceedings or provide public testimony, her response remained consistent. No media appearances, only resolution. By the end of the week, the public narrative had shifted dramatically. What had commenced as a localized inquiry into a missing permit in a remote township had escalated into a nationally recognized account of land appropriation, corporate collusion, and an individual's unwavering refusal to capitulate. However, Esther abstained from viewing any news broadcasts. She stood near the barn, her gaze fixed on the scarred earth, the very ground where heavy vehicles had once arrived and departed, where boots had pressed deeply into her domain with arrogant impunity, assuming she would yield. She did not yield, and her adversaries would forever remember the repercussions of underestimating her resolve. The indictments were issued with promptness following the submission of Cal's sworn statement into evidence. During a confidential court session attended by federal prosecutors and forensic accountants, his confession, corroborated by GPS tracking data, documented wire transfers, and internal communications extracted from seized server systems, became the linchpin of a case that had been meticulously developed in the background. One by one, members of the State Energy Board, municipal zoning officials, and regulatory agents who had routinely approved illicit agreements began submitting their resignations. Some cited personal matters as their reason for departure, while others disappeared behind non-disclosure agreements. Nevertheless, the media coverage presented a far more transparent account than any official pronouncement, a coordinated effort to defraud vulnerable landowners for the benefit of a clandestine syndicate operating through shell corporations and offshore financial arrangements. The individuals apprehended in Esther's barn had been transferred into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Investigation by the time the morning sun reached its zenith. She had intentionally left the barn doors ajar to allow the federal agents unobstructed access to the evidence. They discovered the captives had been provided with sustenance, received necessary medical attention, and were seated beneath a continuously recording camera that had meticulously documented every hour of their confinement. Esther had ensured all circumstances were maintained with cleanliness, devoid of injuries beyond those sustained during the confrontation, and no harm inflicted subsequent to their surrender. They had been furnished with blankets, potable water, and medical support. One of the agents, after reviewing the recorded footage, simply offered a nod and made an entry in his report. Subject employed non-lethal restraint methods and demonstrated a clear intent to preserve life once targets were incapacitated. No further inquiries were deemed necessary. Regarding those who had not survived the night, their remains were recovered with meticulous care, catalogued and preserved by professionals trained to handle such situations without necessitating an explanation from Esther regarding the events that transpired in the darkness. The evidence itself provided the narrative. The propane flare discovered adjacent to the woodpile, the fragmented debris pattern near the southern boundary fence, and the deep indentations left by the breaching tools still clutched in the hands of the deceased. Each piece of evidence aligned precisely with her account and corresponded with the timestamps recorded by her strategically placed surveillance cameras. The subsequent federal inquiry would officially categorize all 10 fatalities as a result of defensive actions undertaken during an organized armed assault. This designation, though a legal term, carried no negative implications for her reputation. Sheriff Cobb's attempt at evasion proved short-lived. After failing to cross state lines, utilizing a fabricated identity and a rented vehicle obtained under an expired mining permit, he was apprehended by a discreet task force stationed at the county border. His luggage contained more than fraudulent identification. It held an encrypted thumb drive detailing bribery schemes, directives for land acquisition, and a partial roster of targeted properties. Esther's name was conspicuously circled in red ink. He was afforded no opportunity to present his defense in court. His initial hearing was conducted in a closed session, inaccessible to the public. Although his booking photograph was disseminated within hours, the official press release merely stated, "Charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice in a multi-state fraud investigation. Bail has been denied." Mariah Knox managed the remaining proceedings with surgical precision. She and Esther meticulously reviewed every legal document together at the antique kitchen table, the very location where the initial conflict had commenced. It was there, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp, that they formulated the strategies for restitution. Esther's mineral rights were not only acknowledged but also placed under comprehensive federal protection through a specific provision within the Whistleblower Land Security Act, a clause rarely invoked but deemed applicable given the attempted land seizure and the violence she had endured. These rights were rendered irrevocable, ensuring the land could never be encroached upon without her explicit consent. All loopholes and deceptive practices were definitively eliminated. When Mariah extended an offer to Esther to join the advisory board of a newly established land protection coalition named in tribute to her courageous stance, Esther declined with the same quiet conviction that had sustained her throughout the ordeal. "I did not undertake this effort to join another assembly of individuals with opinions," she stated plainly. "My objective was to ensure that the next black woman holding a property deed does not have to resort to armed defense merely to retain her inheritance." Instead, she utilized a portion of her awarded compensation, not from legal settlements intended to silence her, but from the untainted federal disbursement linked to protected mineral claims to establish the King Land Trust. Its mission was straightforward: to identify, safeguard, and preserve black-owned agricultural properties throughout the southern United States. Free from political maneuvering and public scrutiny, the trust would operate through meticulous record-keeping, formidable legal representation, and the establishment of permanent ownership that could not be compromised by fraudulent bids or obscure contractual clauses. The individuals who had confronted her never uttered her name again in the courtroom. Cal accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for providing all his knowledge, which proved to be extensive. The two men apprehended alongside him also agreed to plea bargains, their silence effectively traded for a reduced period of incarceration. None of them ever set foot within her barn again. The land itself, the fields that had once concealed defensive measures and absorbed the spillage of blood, gradually returned to a state of quietude. This quietude was not indicative of forgetfulness, but rather analogous to the manner in which trees retain the memory of storms without the need for verbal articulation. Vegetation re-emerged over the concealed safe, and the fence posts stood erect once more. In the far corner of the property, where the earth exhibited a deeper crimson hue than elsewhere, Esther erected no memorial. She allowed the natural elements to reclaim that particular space. When later queried about her refusal of all media invitations, feature article proposals, and speaking engagements, she offered a single response. It was directed to Mariah, seated on the porch one evening as the sky transitioned through shades of orange behind the distant hills. "They already possess my narrative," she remarked. "I have no need to remarket it to them." The newly installed planks on the shed did not match the original structure. They were smoother, lighter in color, and still retained a faint aroma of sawdust and fresh sealant. However, Esther found this discrepancy unobjectionable. She ran her hand along the wood grain, appreciating the clean lines where chaos had erupted weeks prior. Around her, the sounds of reconstruction were subtle yet persistent. The gentle scraping of a trowel, the rhythmic thudding of boots against the soil, and the occasional percussive tap of a hammer when a particularly resistant nail was encountered. None of these activities were performed with undue haste. The volunteers who arrived did so without grand speeches or expressions of sympathy. They came equipped with tool belts and thermoses, their actions reflecting ingrained habits from lives previously dedicated to service, carrying a quiet understanding of the profound loss and the subsequent necessity of rebuilding. The shed was the initial project, but not the sole endeavor. Across the western acreage, a new edifice gradually took shape throughout the summer, designed with a low profile and an expansive foundation, featuring rooms that opened onto broad verandas and corridors intentionally constructed without sharp corners. It was conceived as a sanctuary, intended for practical use rather than formal ceremony or public acclaim. Veterans arrived from neighboring and distant counties, some displaying the weariness of their experiences in the subtle curvature of their spines, others in their prolonged, contemplative gazes towards the tree lines. They did not inquire about the events that had transpired on the property. The wind still carried faint echoes of the past, and the resident canines ensured that no unauthorized individuals approached without explicit permission. However, they respected the prevailing tranquility, and this was deemed sufficient. Mariah visited periodically, typically on weekends, delivering updates on legislative developments, victories in land rights advocacy, and occasionally bringing sustenance in the form of cornbread and strong black coffee. She consistently parked her vehicle in the same designated spot, slightly before the majestic willow tree that leaned over the gravel pathway, as if it had been a silent witness to the entire conflict. Esther would accompany her on the porch, where the two women would sit in comfortable silence, free from any sense of urgency, without the need to fill the intervening space with anything beyond their shared presence. Occasionally, they would discuss the progress of the land trust, noting the expansion of its acreage, identifying upcoming counties for its initiatives, and strategizing methods to counter new threats presented in more palatable forms. More frequently, however, they would simply observe the sunset. One morning, shortly after dawn, the front screen door creaked open and a flash of tawny fur streaked across the porch steps. The puppy was agile, exhibiting a boisterous energy that seemed disproportionate to its small stature. It completed 2 circuits around the garden before colliding directly with a rake, toppling it with a metallic clang that startled birds from the surrounding trees. Esther did not flinch. She stepped deliberately into the sunlight, leaning on the cane that now provided support for her right side, and observed the unfolding commotion in her yard. "Bullet!" she called out calmly. The puppy ceased its frantic circling, turned, and bounded back towards her, skidding to a halt just before her boots. She slowly lowered herself into a crouch, using one hand to steady herself on her knee and the other to gently stroke the top of its head. "You'll learn," she murmured. "Everything worth protecting requires patience." Each subsequent morning, she resumed her perambulations across the fields. She did not traverse the entire perimeter. Those routes had become more arduous, and her legs still exhibited stiffness when the weather turned cold, but she walked sufficiently to allow the land to acknowledge her presence, to reaffirm that she had not forgotten the considerable cost associated with its preservation. The rhythmic tapping of her cane against the earth had supplanted the weight of a rifle, but it conveyed no lesser significance. She frequently paused at the edge of the garden, at the incline overlooking the creek, and at the small patch of ground where the deepest saturation of blood had occurred. Her gaze was not directed in search of intruders, but rather in observation of burgeoning life. A new sprout, a bird's nest nestled within a fence post, or the tracks of a deer she had observed previously but had not encountered since. And when she stood at the crest of the highest field, the area consistently most exposed to the prevailing winds, she allowed her vision to sweep across the open terrain, then downward towards the house, and finally back again. She uttered the same declaration each time, not audibly, but with an inner conviction, as if speaking directly to the land itself. "I am still vigilant." The breeze carried her silent words across the grass, past the mended fences and the newly cultivated soil, into the secluded hollows where menacing whispers had once resided, and where now only the rustling sound of leaves transforming in the wind could be heard. Behind her, the house stood steadfast. Ahead, the horizon awaited, not with the anticipation of conflict, but rather with the promise of whatever future unfolded. The grave was situated discreetly at the edge of the northern pasture, beneath a dense canopy of sugar maple trees that shed golden foliage in October and maintained a tranquil stillness throughout the year. Esther had not visited this location in 10 years, not due to forgetfulness, nor because grief had driven her away, but rather because the unspoken understanding between them had always rendered verbal communication unnecessary. He had once articulated that genuine affection did not necessitate continuous maintenance, asserting that their connection was rooted far deeper than words, transcending physical location and the passage of time itself. Nevertheless, on this particular morning, she arose early, dressed without consulting a mirror, and traversed the entire expanse from the house to the tree line with a slow, deliberate grace that required no permission from the land. It already recognized her presence. She brought no floral tributes, only the flash drive. It fit between her fingers as if it were an artifact far more ancient than a contemporary electronic device, akin to a coin worn smooth through prolonged use, its contents far exceeding the capacity of mere plastic to convey. She knelt with meticulous care, her knees protesting the movement, yet not to the extent of preventing her actions. The morning dew had not yet evaporated, and the ambient chill touched the hem of her coat as she extended her hand and carefully slid the flash drive beneath the edge of the gravestone. Its placement was not intended for permanence, but rather to signify a concluding action, an act not of retribution, but of definitive closure. The headstone was unadorned, precisely as he had requested. It bore no military insignia, no dates of service, and no platitudes, only his name, and beneath it, etched in stone, the words that served as their enduring field mantra: "Stand quiet, see far." She then lowered herself onto her heels, exhaled audibly through her nostrils, and allowed the breeze to carry her voice. "They came here, believing I would yield," she declared, her tone even and steady, neither softened by sentiment nor hardened by pain. They assumed this old house was merely that old. They believed I was past fighting. They presumed you were no longer present." She cast a glance toward the horizon, then returned her gaze to the name inscribed on the stone. "But you married a sniper." The silence that followed was not one of emptiness, but rather a profound fullness, stretched wide like the expectant pause preceding a sunrise, awaiting only the ascent of memory. With that realization, the atmosphere surrounding her seemed to decelerate, and what transpired next was not a visual experience, but a deeply embedded recollection. A sudden surge of heat, her younger self, her hair secured beneath a cap, her breathing controlled through the scope at the distant crest of a remote hill, her heartbeat synchronized with the wind, her gaze sharp and unwavering, the grip of the rifle steady. Her finger poised not out of aggression, but in adherence to duty. Then, the gentle warmth of her husband's laughter, radiant and unrestrained, echoing from a jeep parked beside a tent in Kandahar, him playfully teasing her about her unerring accuracy and how she even imbued silence with tactical significance. She would roll her eyes but smile nonetheless, for he was the sole individual who never regarded her as someone in need of correction. Another memory surfaced. The night he brought her to this very land, assuring her that the soil was fertile and possessed inherent veins of strength, much like her own character. They had stood on this precise field, observing the sky transform from a coppery hue to a deep indigo, speaking little, allowing the future to envelop them without apprehension. And then, that final exchange years later, just before he departed for the meeting that ultimately cost him everything, his hand resting on her shoulder, unspoken words conveying volumes, and her silent promise that should anything befall him, she would stand her ground, regardless of the form the threat might assume. She blinked slowly once, and the present moment reasserted itself. Her fingers grazed the edge of the stone, not for the purpose of cleaning it or fussing over it, but simply to confirm its continued presence, to ascertain that he remained here, not observing from above, nor whispering from the trees, but at rest, because now, finally, she could inform him that her task was complete. She rose, utilizing her cane for balance, and stood facing the pasture. Bullet sat nearby, observing with a curious tilt of his head, as if sensing that this was not an ordinary stroll. "You can rest now," she said, directing her words not to the wind or the earth, but to the palpable space situated between them. And with that, she turned and commenced her return journey along the well-worn path towards the house, her cane tapping a steady rhythm against the ground, the flash drive securely concealed beneath the stone, and the sun ascending powerfully at her back. The film crew arrived late in the afternoon, their van navigating the gravel pathway with cautious tires, as if even their equipment recognized the sacred nature of the ground it was traversing. Esther had consented to the interview only after securing two assurances: that she would have the final prerogative in the discussion, and that no portion of the footage would be altered to dilute the unvarnished truth. No theatrics, no sentimentality, no sorrow. She was clad in a deep sapphire shirt, the cuffs rolled just past her wrists, and a silver brooch on the lapel, a memento from her late husband. The dog lay at her feet while the director finessed the audio settings, consciously averting his gaze from the rows of tarnished traps displayed on a shelf behind her. The old stable, now meticulously cleaned, held a subtle aroma of freshly hewn timber and fertile ground, as if it too had anticipated this discussion. As the camera indicator glowed red, she remained silent for a moment, allowing the atmosphere to thicken, the production team to shift with unease in the quietude. Then, her gaze, unwavering as the telescopic sight she had once intimately known, fixed beyond the lens. She commenced, not with a vivid account of the night's violence, but by addressing the earth itself. They hadn't sought the dwelling, she stated. The perimeter, the water source, even the verdant growth held little appeal. Their pursuit was of what lay concealed, and they presumed she lacked the fortitude to defend what was unseen. Her tone remained measured, her composure unbroken when questioned about any potential regrets. Instead, she offered a discourse on history, not the kind chronicled in academic volumes, but the history embedded in hastily filed deeds, falsified signatures, and territories seized not by force of arms, but through subtle coercion, persistent pressure, and gradual erasure. She spoke not as a victim, but as a guardian, one who perceived the unfolding pattern long before the wider world recognized it. The recorded segment was broadcast 3 weeks later, occupying a primetime schedule with minimal pre-release publicity. Despite this, its reach expanded exponentially. There was something in her bearing, her resolute refusal to be diminished or rendered a mere symbol, that connected with an audience more profoundly than the producers had anticipated. What originated as a feature on a solitary landowner confronting corporate aggression evolved into a nationwide reevaluation, for concealed within the records that Esther had helped to bring to light, alongside Mariah's diligent compilation, was a pervasive scheme that spanned 3 states, encompassing 5 distinct counties and implicating 7 families, all of whom were African American, and all targeted for the mineral wealth latent beneath land long dismissed as neglected. A single corporate entity appeared repeatedly across the documentation, though never in a primary capacity. These were phantom organizations identified as Green Horizon LLC and Southern Future Ventures, among others. Auction records bore the signatures of intermediaries devoid of any digital trace. Land acquisition specialists vanished when legal summonses were issued. Yet the disparate threads coalesced. The subsequent federal inquiry broadened its scope considerably. By the time the official charges were made public, more than a dozen individuals had either stepped down or were subjected to investigation. Esther's own situation, once perceived as a secluded rural peculiarity, now formed the core of a widespread scandal. She declined every invitation for public speaking, every podcast appearance, every offer to deliver a guest lecture. Her desire was not to become a marketable persona, but she consented to participate in one final recorded interview. This took place several months later, filmed discreetly on her veranda, without the intervention of a makeup artist or the attachment of a microphone to her clothing. Only her voice, accompanied by the gentle murmur of the wind through the surrounding vegetation. "I require no monument," she articulated. "Simply cease your encroachment upon the land. Allow it to experience the peace denied to us." Consequently, the concluding scenes of the broadcast depicted not corporate boardrooms or judicial chambers, but her hands carefully setting new saplings near the boundary of her property. It was the very spot where her husband had once pledged they would cultivate their own sustenance once more, even if the world forgot the means. Bullet nudged the soil beside her, his tail wagging gently, his ears perked at the passing breeze. In the distance, the recently reconstructed outbuilding cast a shadow shaped like an empty rifle rack, its wood gleaming, now devoid of any weaponry. A modest flag fluttered from a short staff nearby. It was not the national ensign, but a weathered emerald banner bearing the hand-stitched initials of her husband's former military unit. The land no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a repository of memory, finally granted the space to draw breath. I trust that narrative resonated with you. Kindly disseminate it amongst your acquaintances and subscribe to ensure you are apprised of subsequent installments. In the interim, I've thoughtfully selected 2 other narratives that I believe will capture your interest. May your day be a most pleasant one.